for all the difference that exists in the world and the difference that there is to discover, there's so much more that could connect us if we let ourselves be led by what God has created in each of us that is core to who we are.
Welcome to Catholics in Ordinary Time. My name is Father Jack Bentz, and I am your host. This week's guest is Lindsey Horvath. Lindsey Horvath, I first met as a congregant in the parish where I served in Hollywood. And I knew her as someone who was a Eucharistic minister during the Mass, also that she had been in the choir, and also as one of those young adults whose schedule is too full to do more than just kind of encourage people about the young adult ministry at the parish. But it turns out that she's actually kind of a political operative in the area. She had been on the city council of West Hollywood and then mayor of West Hollywood, I think twice. And now she currently serves as an elected official, as a county supervisor, one of them for LA County, which is a huge job. One of those kind of quiet jobs, which can be super effective, and she is in the entire county of Los Angeles. A very diverse county, very populous county, very complex politically, and she navigates all of that. I think you'll find this interview really interesting. I did. She comes across as someone who does a lot of interviews, so she's really articulate about why she does what she does and how she does it. And I think she really connects her work as a public servant to her life following Christ. I really enjoy this episode, and I hope you do as well. And if you do enjoy it, please share it with other people that might like this kind of interview as well. Enjoy. Welcome on Catholics in Ordinary Time. This is our second season, and this second season is built around queer Catholic women who remain in the church. And how, why, and every off-ramp is offered to you, and here you are, part of the church. So we get to talk about that. So I'd like to go all the way back. You started out as a small child in Ohio. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
And what kind of Catholic upbringing did you have out in Ohio?
Oh, well, I guess it's sort of hard to describe in a way because I grew up in a very small town where we saw most people we knew at church on the weekend, and sort of like a Disney after school special where we, got dropped off at the stop sign. And as we walked home, Miss Greben would be there to wave to us, and Miss Verdell had their golden retriever out front, and Miss Greben would give us popsicles as we would, walk. I mean, it was very Disney after school special. We all knew each other. We played hide and go seek in everybody's backyards. I lived at the center of a cul-de-sac.
Oh God.
But and so in some ways it was very, working class, middle America, and everything that sort of came with that, in terms of, but in a political context, I guess, it leaned blue at the time because of the working class nature. And I think the relationship between the Democratic Party having a successful and strong relationship with middle class and working class people. But I also think, because of, Catholicism and some of the social values that come with that, it was in some ways conservative. And so it was sort of both in terms of my experience. There were things that, were taught to us in sort of the very strict language, of traditional church teaching. And then I also think in practice, I was sort of the kid who was listening intently in my religion classes and hearing it said, we're supposed to treat others the way we want to be treated, love others as we love ourselves. We're called to welcome people into the church and be of service to those who are least among us, which are all very, very socially progressive values in a political context.
You were paying a lot more attention than I was.
So if you're thinking in those terms, I would come home, and if I heard things that sounded discriminatory or exclusive, or I would sort of question and push back. And so I guess that's why I say it's complicated. I typically just identify as a social justice Catholic because of the teachings of the church that really resonate with me. But in practice, it was a little bit of both in terms of how I was raised, the things that I heard, and the priority issues that got talked about, in a community setting.
And is your family ethnically Catholic as well?
So interestingly, both my mother's father and mother were both born and raised Catholic. My dad's mom was raised Catholic. She's Irish.
Hmm.
So, I'm told I get a little bit of her feistiness. His dad was not
Hmm.
actually until he got his last rites. He served in the army. He ended up getting diagnosed at an early age because of cancer, because of the work that he did with
Hmm.
in the military. And so sort of like on his deathbed, as my dad describes it, he got all of the sacraments, and he didn't even tell my grandmother he was going to do it. It just meant, he always encouraged my dad and his three brothers to, adhere to their mother's, wishes in terms of, following a Catholic faith. And then, as he was dying, made all the sacraments
Hmm.
so he could himself be Catholic too.
I see. So it wasn't
Yeah.
kind of the Middle European immigrants, Catholic ethnically, and
Not entirely,
yeah,
not
yeah,
exclusively. So much, yes. And in fact, I've not done a ton of research, but I do know that, my grandfather's Hungarian. Horvath is
yeah.
Hungarian. And I've actually learned that, many Horvaths were Jewish in Hungary.
Mm,
And
hmm.
so understanding that part of the history has been interesting for me. Every time ancestry.com updates, my percentage Jewish increases. And so that's always an interesting dynamic.
What's your current
But
percentage?
I think I'm like right around
Oh,
10%.
okay,
So,
that's good.
but I think, it's an, who knows about all of
Sure.
that? I don't, but it's just an interesting factoid to me more than anything else. But,
Yeah,
all of my family, and how I was raised really was in Catholic tradition.
yeah. And then you, as I recall, you went to school at Notre Dame.
I
And
did.
did you go there because it was Catholic? I mean, it's a good school, but because of the Catholic part, or
I think that appealed to me. Is interesting. So my family moved to Las Vegas when I was 15.
okay,
And so the high school that I went to when I was in Las Vegas, the Meadows School, was the only school I attended from kindergarten through end of university that wasn't Catholic. And when I moved to Las Vegas, I was, it was just after my freshman year in high school, when you're sort of starting to question all kinds of things you've
sure,
been raised with anyway. And at the time, I was sort of seen as a little bit pushing the boundaries within my Catholic school constructs, at the school that I was at the time. And then I go to Las Vegas, and people might think, oh, it's very progressive or something, or liberal compared to middle America. And yet I found myself my sophomore year in the hallway on Ash Wednesday. I went to serve. It was the first time I wasn't going to be able to go to Catholic, to observe services within my school context,
sure.
because I always went to church at school. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to go to church before I go to school. So I went up and went to 7 a.m. services and came into my school. And so I had my ashes on my forehead, and there were, these kids sort of whispering, and, in the lockers. And finally I was like, what are you talking? Like, what is the issue? And this, one guy who was not so kind to me generally was like, I can't believe you smear the ashes of dead people on your forehead. I was like, you think this is dead people? So then I found myself like in the middle of my hallway at high school, like giving a catechism about what ashes represent, and Ash Wednesday and the meaning of all of it. And so I think I realized while I was in high school how much my faith actually was my own.
Mm,
So I didn't choose Notre Dame, I think, exclusively because it was Catholic, but I think I chose it because it felt connected to something in me. And when I went and visited all the schools to which I had been accepted, it was the last one I visited. And I remember my mom and I were driving up, sort of the main road, and it was late at night, and the Golden Dome was lit up, and it was just like, so, everything you might imagine. And I just started crying. I was like, I really hope this is it, because it's just beautiful. And it feels so, like a place I'm connected to, even though I had never been there.
yeah.
So, yeah.
And you've got a very good forehead for ashes, so you know.
Thank you for
You're
that.
welcome.
My dermatologist helps me with that. Thank you.
So that probably why you continue as Catholic, because you got the right
Uh,
forehead for it.
Thanks.
So you go to school, and
Yeah.
it's a Catholic school, but how did you find the Catholic culture there? Did it support you, or were you at a moment in your life where you kind of dug deep into that, or how was that?
Yeah, it was challenging, I would
Mm,
say. On the one hand, it was really nice to be in a place where people were raised similarly in a very general sense. But I would also say, who you are, especially as a young adult, and how you're sort of discovering yourself and all the things that come with that, ended up being in a more socially conservative context than I think was sort of who I was discovering I was. And, I think there were lots of things about the conservatism that were familiar from how I was raised and the way, I had a great aunt who, when she found out I got accepted to Notre Dame, she was like, "This is great. You can, go to college and find a husband." And I was like, "Or I can get an education." So
two options.
Yeah. So, but there was sort of, it's not that as if there weren't, very traditional things that were part of my upbringing, but I think, because of faith in action for me, what does it mean to be a Catholic in practice, especially as a young adult? I think I liked that Notre Dame was sort of not the whole world in a small place. There were many universities that felt way too much for me. I sort of liked a little bit of the protection that I got at Notre Dame from sort of the rest of the world to be able to wrestle with big questions and the things that I was sort of learning about myself. But I also liked that, as I was ready to sort of use my voice on things that I cared about on the campus, the dorms at Notre Dame are all single sex. And so I was it was the first time I was really immersed in a community that was exclusively girls. Most of my cousins, not all, but most of my cousins that I grew up with were boys, and I had a younger brother. And so I just, I grew up just having relationships with men more frequently and more positively. And so it was sort of like, oh, how's this going to work? As it turned out, I was really blessed to be to find that, what is unique about a community of women that helps you discover things out about your female identity and whatever that means to you, in a way that I hadn't before. But it also opened up to me, issues that a lot of women were experiencing on campus, whether it was eating disorders and, things that I hadn't experienced or really understood before, but, were sort of shared in safer spaces, sexual assault, sexual violence, all kinds of issues. And so because I was sort of identified as somebody who was willing to listen to whatever somebody's experience was, and to, really talk about what people wanted to talk about, and people felt safe talking about things that maybe other people might get either immediately judgy about or just not want to talk about it all because it's, not appropriate. I ended up being a person that a lot of people came to with all kinds of different things. And so, I was a gender studies second major. So some of that was sort of inherent in my, desire to explore and understand this whole gender identity and what does gender mean and how do people express it and how does that play out in our world. But some of it was just, being a young woman. Some of it was being in this community of women. And then the expectation that gets placed on you being a Catholic woman at Notre Dame. I think there were all kinds of different lenses through which my personal experience was happening and then how it played out in my activism. And so, on campus, I was eventually drawn to produce the vagina monologues on my campus, which, was quite a challenge at Notre Dame, I will say. It was written about in all kinds of publications. And, as a college student, I was suddenly dealing with national press and all kinds of protests that were happening on campus and all kinds of things that I had to navigate with the administration and with my fellow students and all of that. And in so doing, then, friends of mine who were involved with the Queer Film Festival came to us and said, you seem to be doing a good job with the vagina monologues. Like, how are you getting the university to support you? We're having a really hard time. And so, I was sort of willing to talk with them about all of, what our experience had been with the vagina monologues and try to help them navigate how they could have, create safe spaces for students to talk about all of that. And in fact, by the time my senior year rolled around, we brought, there was a whole group of students that created a Gay Straight Student Alliance, which is now become an officially recognized university group. And I remember when that happened, I cried because I was like, when I was on campus, I couldn't imagine the possibility of that. But at the time, it was a big lift. And, we each sort of took on a different aspect of what affirming the LGBTQ community on campus, especially on a Catholic campus, could look like, and who we wanted to be, as allies, who we wanted to be, in relationship to the whole community. And so we started that sort of as a very student initiated group, and the work sort of took off from there. I took on, I lost faculty to discrimination on campus. I had a couple of professors who were gender studies professors who were, technically under a larger department like English or something, so they would go to, the Christmas party at the end of the year with their partner and just get harassed. And, they they would file claims with the university that would get rejected because, they were basically told, what the environment is here, and people are allowed to express their difference of opinion under their religious beliefs. And it was really horrible. And so there was this, I would say subversive, maybe they would too, but there was this subversive group of professors on campus who actually created manuals for women who were coming onto campus to sort of navigate what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be lesbian, what it meant to be, all of these things, and called it best practices. And so one of my work study jobs was that I helped them lay out the typeset for this book to be printed. And I did copy editing and I worked with them on it. But it was really amazing to work with these professors who took it upon themselves to really try and cultivate a more welcoming and inviting relationship for faculty to come to the campus. And so it was, it was pretty exciting in that regard, and to have faculty leadership that you could look to and engage with in dialogue. And so, in the context of the Gay Straight Student Alliance, I took on a couple of roles. First was to try and work on the idea of getting non-discrimination language into the university's non-discrimination language for faculty, so that way we could protect our beloved faculty who were trying to, just teach us. And then also that turned into sort of a conversation around safe spaces. And so how, if we couldn't get it written into overall non-discrimination language for the entire university, we started, what I decided we would do is, well, what if we just go to different academic departments and to dorms on campus and say, would you affirm that this non-discrimination policy that affirms, the dignity and respect for LGBTQ community members, would you sign this and have it displayed somewhere in your space so faculty, students, whomever know that this is a safe space for them to enter and be their full authentic selves? And so slowly, different departments and different dorms were willing to take that on. Others, were sort of more reticent, but that was how we began the conversation on our campus. But there were all kinds of efforts that were being taken on, from the Queer Film Festival and arts and culture to any number of things, because before the Gay Straight Student Alliance, there was this prayer called the Spirit of Inclusion, and it had like this beautiful prayer card with the dome but rainbow, and all of the work for the LGBTQ community was in the context of campus ministry. And so that for some people was a welcome space, because they felt comfortable expressing their faith. For other people, for obvious reasons, it was so not the space that they would turn to talk about their identity and find support. And so, so this whole notion of gender on campus and, whether it was, women and feminism and sexuality and all kinds of conversations that are difficult in the church, to gender identity and expression and, orientation and all of that was, very much what my experience was at Notre Dame, even though that is so not the typical experience of students at Notre Dame.
I was going to ask a little later how you got into politics, but I think that's been answered.
It's interesting because I think the thing that I attribute most to Notre Dame isn't necessarily like the subject matter of all these, progressive issues. It was just I learned that I had a skill set in navigating bureaucracy to
Yeah.
actually get things done. So
Right.
even if there were rules or attitudes that prevented you, that ostensibly would have prevented you from doing something or getting something accomplished, I found ways to develop relationship and make incremental change and help, find inroads so that way
Hmm.
we could solve some of those problems. And I
No.
think that skill set really helps me now.
Yeah. That's super important to the work you do and have done since then. That's interesting. How was your prayer life during that? Like during that time? I know you're involved in kind of the outward facing social justice part of how that's connected to, the gospel. But how was your kind of day-to-day prayer life? Was it sustaining it during that time, or was it given a boost, or how did that work?
I think it was both. I mean, I joined the Notre Dame folk choir. So I was
Oh
at church
gosh.
every Sunday singing at the Basilica and very much had a prayerful faith community
Hmm.
that I was able to join and become a part of. We had mass in our dorms that every dorm had a
Hmm.
chapel. So, like we could go to mass, and in my dorm, we did mass at 11 p.m. on Sundays. So everybody like went in their pajamas and
Hmm.
like, it was pretty fun. They made your faith life and accessing your faith life very, much just easy for
Hmm.
college students, and created spaces for people who wanted more of that, whether it was through, specifically through campus ministry, and people who wanted to pursue vocations to, there was a center for social concerns that was really more faith in action and how do you put into practice some of these social justice attitudes and work that people aspire to, in pursuing their, living out their faith. So I went to church on Sundays. I very much had a faith community. The summer between my junior and senior year, I actually stayed on campus, and my summer job that year was, they did sort of this summer camp for kids, that was all about faith.
Hmm.
And so I was the music component. Some of us stayed back and they wrote musicals, and we sang, we did the music ministry, for 2 sessions that summer. And I think that was a place where, you have much more intense conversation. You're always sort of immersed in talking about your faith and what it means to you, and in practice, and living out your life, how it shows up. And so I think Notre Dame absolutely was the right place for me, and sort of affirming, um, what my Catholic
Hmm.
identity was for me and how I could, really have ownership of it. And in fact, when I went to Hollywood and, moved to LA and started going to Blessed Sacrament. And I think that too was sort of the, like, in my adulthood, the moment where I was like, yes, this faith is mine. It's
Mm.
not because my parents told it to me. It's not because I went to Catholic school. It's not because I'll feel ashamed in the presence of my grandparents if I'm not, it wasn't any of those things. It was like, this is mine, and I get to decide what that means for me as an adult. I get to decide what that means for me in my interior life, in my spiritual life, in my prayer life, and my values, and developing what drives me. And so, yeah, it's been a journey.
Yeah, because you moved to LA, and
Mhm.
then you eventually get involved in local politics as well,
Yeah,
and you served twice as mayor of West Hollywood, which
I
is
did.
crazy.
Yes.
And when you started being in those kind of roles, how did
Yeah.
you kind of sync up uh, being a Catholic and doing that kind of work? Did you see it as an extension of, or?
I mean, for me, it was,
Mhm.
but certainly for the community, that was not necessarily how they always wanted me to show up. I mean, it's
Sure.
interesting because when I first I moved to Hollywood, and I sort of chose Blessed Sacrament based on two things. First of all, I could walk there and I didn't have a car.
Mhm.
And second, because it had an LGBT ministry. And so I felt like if a church had that ministry, that it might, as a community, as a faith community, share more of my values.
Mhm.
And so I started going to church there, and the gay men I met, in the ministry, like I was one of the only women who ever showed up. It was usually just gay men who were there.
Yeah.
And we would do potlucks. Like there was this whole practice of, there was a Sunday that was dedicated to, making visible all of the ministries that serve the church. And at the time, the women who made the banners for each of the ministries sort of refused to make a banner for the LGBT ministry. And I was sort of shocked. And then I was like, well, I guess, yes, even though it's LA and even though it's Hollywood, I guess that is possible. So I said, okay, boys, like, let's go. And so we went down to the fashion district. We got our own fabric. We got like a bamboo pole. Like we made our own makeshift banner that was sort of in the spirit of the other banners, but clearly it was different. And so when all of these beautiful banners were, up on display on the altar, ours was there too, very different, but still we had a banner and we were represented. But like, so in that way, within the context of my very specific faith life and faith community, that sort of was a thing. And then, when I moved to West Hollywood and was in a community that was known, for its LGBT community, for being progressive on gender issues, on so many fronts, being the first pro-choice city in America, so many other things. Just being a human, getting involved in international human rights conversations, showing up as a Catholic person was not necessarily what people wanted. In fact, there was a commissioner I met who was gay in West Hollywood who had fallen away from his faith as a Catholic. And when I got onto the council, I was first appointed to the council before I was later elected. And I, in one of my opening speeches or remarks or something, I referenced being Catholic, and he came to me afterwards and said, nobody ever talks about that here. Nobody really speaks in this community about faith life or anything like that, especially not a Catholic faith. And he says, so I really appreciate you talking about that because it's encouraged me to like get reacquainted with that. And he eventually left West Hollywood to go back into the priesthood. And wow. So, I think all of those experiences have sort of reminded me that like, you never know who you might connect with by talking about who you are and what is important to you and what sort of shapes who you are and how you act in the world. And so while there were definitely spaces that I didn't lead with explicitly calling myself out as Catholic, though I would wear a cross or whatever could identify me as such. And I was never embarrassed of it or hiding it. I think that, because it's part of who I am and why I serve, I think sometimes that just sort of becomes self-evident.
Yeah. And when I think about the issues that are even from just a regular person looking at positions, leadership in West Hollywood, and then the work you do now in LA County as a supervisor, when I think of all the issues that pop up that you deal with either in an emergency sense, like the fires, or the kind of more permanent, well, they seem permanent, difficulties of folks being unhoused, growth or the limits thereof, or those kinds of pieces, the immigration piece, all those pieces seem like those are right out of the urgings of the gospel to get involved. And there you are out getting involved and doing, I'm sure, sometimes the very unglamorous kind of technical work that you do. And you're able to connect that in your interior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I think for people who don't always connect their faith lives or even have a faith practice to what their political work is, sometimes those things are divorced. Like I go to church and then I do my whatever,
right.
And I found that there were surprisingly many, Catholics in Los Angeles who, on the issue of homelessness, for example, got to a place where they were like, I just want it cleaned up. I just want the city doesn't feel safe. I just want these people to kind of go away. And I was like, okay, well, and so then you would sort of challenge them on, well, we are called to minister to people who, are least among us, who, to clothe the naked, house the homeless, everything out of Matthew. And so I would sort of push back on some of that. And there are certainly people who are living their faith in action in that way. People who, but I by some would be, consider, this compassionate progressive who isn't going to be tough on the issues. It's like, no, it's not about not being tough on the issues. It's about recognizing the dignity and humanity in each human being and the value of each human life that we are entrusted to be stewards of. And so I think that is, that is a driving force for me always. I think different people, we're not a monolith, the Catholic community. And so how we act in our faith is, shows up in a lot of different ways, as we know. And those who might attempt to speak in our name under the banner of Catholic sometimes do the thing that, that article about the nuns in Africa did for me, where I was like, oh, I'm not this anymore. It's like, well, no, I am. Maybe they're not. And so, really challenging, what does it mean to put our faith into practice and faith in action? And, in the issues both that we're confronted with, like the, enormity of the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles, like the recent ICE raids by this administration, attacking so many of our immigrant communities and breaking up families and causing terror and fear and harm and destruction. And then there are things, the everyday decisions that, your values, which for me are informed by my Catholic faith and upbringing and, experience, on any number of other issues. What does it mean to be of service to those who are mentally ill or struggling with addiction? What does it mean to, be stewards of, jail facilities and probation halls and camps for our youth? And what, how do we best serve people? And what does all of that mean? And how do we translate spiritual experience that shapes our morality into legislation? And, do those things align? Do they, where do they divert? Where do they align? And so those are always questions that I'm not only being asked, but I'm asking myself. And I know in the Ignatian practice, the practice of examine is something that I try to use, probably not as well or as diligently as you do. But I think, just really reflecting on my day, what went well, what didn't, what my challenges were. How did I show up and who did I show up for? Sort of checking in with myself in that way allows me to try and hold myself accountable to the things that that I say I am and the things that I want to do with the opportunities that I have in my life as an elected or otherwise. And then, it also allows me to sort of, do better the next day, okay, what's my action, reflecting on this day, what's my action plan for the next day and then the next day. And so, I find that even tools from our spiritual life become things that help guide me in how I try to think about my leadership roles.
Do you receive a certain amount of criticism from the Catholic side about how you are holding the wrong positions as a elected leader who identifies as Catholic?
Yes.
The Joe Biden approach, yeah.
I get it. I don't mean it to, I'm not a victim, so I don't mean it to sound exactly this way, but like, I kind of get it from all sides. It's like, people will call me a cafeteria Catholic, that I'm picking and choosing what it is, I believe or don't believe. And, I think especially when I was younger, I felt like I needed to defend that more. And I think that was just an instinct. I had an experience where I was speaking on a panel at the Women's Leadership Conference in West Hollywood. And it was noted in my bio that at the time I was a catechist at Blessed Sacrament. And I was also the president of the National Organization for Women Hollywood chapter. And so afterwards, I had this woman, like come up and she was sort of screaming from the back, like, how can you be both of these things? And, does your pastor know? And I said, yeah, of course he does. I don't hide who I am. And so I was like, if you want to come see what I teach, my students, you're welcome to witness that. I don't teach my personal beliefs. I teach what the church teaches. And it's ultimately for all of us to develop our conscience and inform ourselves, through our study, through our prayer, through our relationship with God, understand who we are going to be. There's doctrine, and then there's, how we live that out. And so, it ended up being sort of this conversation at the time that, my pastor called me in and the person who was head of the religious education program wanted to have a conversation. It was very friendly from their standpoint. So I will say that. But, the fact that, I was sort of like stubborn, that like the fact that I even had to have this conversation, I was annoyed. And, because I felt like I was very transparent from the outset, and that some woman could just call my church and, raise this question, and then suddenly it was a problem, felt like, ugh. But I think that experience helped me sort of get to this place where I am now, where it's, people are going to say what they're going to say. They're going to, make judgments, all the time. And, the more that I can remember that the judgments people make about me are more largely informed by whatever's going on with them than it is about me, that's the place that I sort of sit with. So long as I know that I'm following, what I'm called to be, that I'm, really listening to my heart and being in conversation with God, and making sure I'm staying in the place where I'm called to be, and trying to do my part to bring about what it is His will is for us here. That's really what I try to do. And sometimes we can live in a space with a very exclusive religious language. And sometimes, as an elected leader in the United States of America, that is not a theocracy to date, there is, I believe, a constitutional separation of church and state. And so while our values will guide how we develop policy, we also know that the policy we create has to be inclusive of all of the people that we serve. And so sometimes recognition of other faith traditions, of other belief systems, and other faith and practice means we have to create room through legislation that maybe doesn't quite align with all of the things that we believe, or maybe it does. But there's sort of a give and take. And so there are lots of things that I consider at any given moment when I'm, asked to make a legislative decision, or create policy, or put it into practice. And so I, of course, go through all of that process as I'm, making a decision. I'll, of course, always listening to the people that I serve and how they want their leaders to represent their community, and also making sure I can be the kind of leader they want me to be. If I didn't feel that I could serve a community of, more than half, identified LGBT people in a city like West Hollywood, if I felt like I was going to get in the way of their ability to express who they are and fully realize, and pursue their happiness in their lives, I wouldn't want to be of service to a community. And I don't think they would have chosen me. I think, that would have been pretty obvious. That's sort of how democracy works. But I do think that, I get challenged a lot, and sometimes it's, easy to sort of, wave away. And other times it's very pointed and very personal.
Yeah, I'm sure that it is. So why do you keep going to church? Like, what do you get out of it? Not that it's always like, what do you get out of it, but what's the experience for you that keeps bringing you back?
Yeah. Sometimes it's just, I need an hour where I'm not doing everything else that I do. And so when I'm in church, I'm not on my phone. Nobody else can call me. Like, I'm not thinking about anything else. I'm just in a very, in a quiet, calm space that I'm hoping to connect with God in, but maybe maybe
Sure.
it's so loud out there that it's just the fact that I'm turning down the noise. I really, I love to show up and sort of hear what the lesson is from the gospel each week. And, recently I brought folks from my workspace to church with me. And after the homily, one person leaned over and was like, "Wow, that was pretty amazing." I was like, "Yeah, sometimes like it's the exact thing you need to hear in the moment that you hear it." And so, I find that, my faith practice, I believe that, the liturgy of the Eucharist and, practice of participating in communion with others is very important to me. I think that, that Jesus gave us this practice to continue in his memory, to unify us as a church and what it means. I think all of that is deeply meaningful to me. And I am grateful that, the people that I recognize in church who I might see, they come and advocate at a Metro board meeting, or, come to, the Hall of Administration to talk to us about any sort of issues. Somebody who's in our choir, for example, even, I met her first in that context, that when we're in that space, we are children of God first. And that, whoever we are outside of church, we get to be family inside that space. And I think, I've developed a love for international travel. And so when I've gone to places that I've never been before and visit a church, I've been able to be in communities that are completely unlike I've ever experienced anywhere else. The first time I went to Taiwan was the first country that I went to in Asia. And, it was very unfamiliar to me in many ways. I went to church on Sunday, and it was like, oh, of course, there are people here who are, not maybe speaking exactly the same language, but the same spiritual language. And so we immediately felt connected. And so in that way, it also reminds me that for all the difference that exists in the world and the difference that there is to discover, there's so much more that could connect us if we let ourselves be led by what God has created in each of us that is core to who we are. And so I really love going to church for that reason. Like, you never know who you'll see. I sometimes really love the music and the singing. I did musical theater, so I love that aspect of it, I will say. But I think it's really, it's the space that I have found that especially the turmoil of the politics that we experience right now, it's a place where we can come together unlike any other and be connected as a community. So,
yeah. I'm glad you brought up musical theater, because we certainly share that.
Yes.
So when's the last time you did some musical theater? And can we look forward to that?
Oh my gosh, I would. Yeah, the singing, dancing supervisor. No.
Karaoke. Couple drinks in, and you're up there with "I Dreamed a Dream."
Sure. So there's this cabaret in Hollywood. And anyway, I did sing in the church choir and Blessed Sacrament for a while. I kind of became an unreliable member of the, because they started rehearsal at 3 before 5 o'clock mass. So carving out 3 hours of a Sunday every Sunday is a hard commitment for me to make now. But I love to do it just for fun. I'm now in, the entertainment capital of the world. So it's a little different level of competition here. So there's not really easy community theater to join in that way. But I love it. I love going and seeing theater. And I also think too, I'm sort of a reluctant extrovert. I think it was really my musical theater experience that helped me kind of get out of myself a little bit. And I certainly need that now as I'm speaking in public and, meeting with strangers and going to all different kinds of settings. I think there's a lot about musical theater that helped me develop skills to be able to do more of that in public, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Finally, what's it like? Is it good being Catholic in Los Angeles?
I love being Catholic in Los Angeles. The community here is so diverse and so interesting. I was able to connect with our Holy Father, Pope Francis, and through his personal foundation, the Scholas Foundation, they wanted to, really make a connection. They've been, active. It's a program of encounter for young people, and they use arts and sports and creativity to connect young people of all different backgrounds. It's not religious. It's non-denominational and ecumenical, but they've been on the ground in hundreds of countries around the world, and they finally wanted to make their connection on the ground in the United States. And Pope Francis had directed that he wanted it to be connected in Los Angeles. So mutual friends ended up connecting me to that work. And, being in Los Angeles, I was able to, meet and work with Pope Francis and be connected now more to the Vatican than, I ever would have been at any stage of my life. And, my office, the Hall of Administration, is directly across from the cathedral. And so now, I know the Archbishop who, when he first came in, I think by reputation, he was known to be a little bit more conservative than I think the Los Angeles culture. And so that's been interesting to watch him as a leader and find my way to a relationship with him. And so, there's so much to learn about each other within the Catholic community in Los Angeles, ethnically diverse, in practice diverse, the history of the Catholic Church here is very complicated as well. I have the San Fernando Mission in my district. And so what that has meant for community members has been interesting to sort of unpack and dialogue and work through and wrestle with. And, so there's a lot about being Catholic in Los Angeles that I find incredibly enriching. I found, community with people who otherwise would have been perfect strangers with whom, when I said I was Catholic, it was like, oh, I know what that means. And then we sort of had this shared something between us. So I love it.
Yeah. I so appreciate that you are in leadership because of your great big heart for Los Angeles. Like you came there, you came to Los Angeles, you chose to stay in Los Angeles, and you seem to really see it and love it. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I do. I know, especially recently, I've certainly heard from people who have had a hard time and found the city to be a complete challenge. And, I would say even in my early years in being in Los Angeles, I watched people sort of get chewed up and spit out by this city. And I think the common denominator there was if people didn't find their community, if they didn't find their group, their people, then they sort of got swallowed up by everything that the city is or can turn you into. But if you find other people who are able to keep you true to whomever you were when you came here, when you came to this place, whether that's a spiritual community like your church or whether it's something else, I think that's really been, sort of the common denominator for people who have made their way to Los Angeles and stayed because it's I have found it to be a place that literally anything you want to do in your life, you can do here. And so I think there's something really magical about that. But I also think for people who might get distracted or pulled into places or just have a hard time with the enormity of what is available to you here, there's so much that can take you on a path that leads you to a lack of fulfillment. And so I think certainly there's a number of stories of, people who have experienced brokenness here in Los Angeles. But I think, there's also opportunity to minister and connect and because I want to help people, that I love to do that too.
There's a lot of people there. Yeah. So good. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course.
To speak with me about these topics. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this and for, just creating a space for people who want to really engage with their faith more, but don't always find a space that feels familiar or safe. The fact that you're doing this, I think, is incredibly special. So thank you. Yeah,
I'm glad to do it. Thank you for listening to Catholics in Ordinary Time. This podcast is produced by myself. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing. Also, leave a review because that's how we actually grow. We have a lot more conversations ahead of us. Looking forward to having you on the journey. And thanks again for being part of it.